Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bedtime Stories Week 20 and Day 94, I believe, of Architecture Foundation's 100-day studio program of online events. Thank you to Alicia for the invitation. My name is Amandeep Singh Kalra, and I will be reading today from a book called The Battle for Home by Marwa Al-Sabouni. I guess when Alicia first asked me to do a reading, I struggled to make a choice, as with I know many of the other readers on the evening program have. I knew I wanted to do something to do with home, and because it's something I'm personally quite passionate about. And after picking up many different books, I ended up on this particular book because it discusses a number of issues such as resilience, war, racial divide, corruption, politics, and immigration at a time of crisis, all through the lens of architecture. But fundamentally, it also talks about the importance of home within the city. It also beautifully is illustrated with sketches by Marwa, which certainly helped me visualize a lot of the context in a much better and is certainly helpful for architects. The book offers a really powerful eyewitness account of the author, a young architect, establishing herself in the war-torn city of Homs in Syria. Marwa's book was highly commended on its release in 2016, and since then she was a finalist for the 2018 Pritzker Award, and she was also selected as one of the BBC's 100 Women in 2019. In the first chapter of this book, and in the context of the civil unrest in Syria, the author writes, "Maybe people simply wish things would go back to the way they were. I've heard this phrase many times from different kinds of people, and each time I hear it, I think, why would anyone support a process of massive change, then simply, and very late in the day, regret the destructive repercussions and want things to go back to the way they were?" I found this sort of first paragraph really powerful at the beginning of the book, and with no intentions of naively comparing the Syrian crisis to a global pandemic, it did bring some thought to my mind. I've had several conversations with friends, families, colleagues, and others who, after the sort of prolonged nature of lockdown, have expressed the view that they really can't wait to get back to the normal. Which sort of, in my mind, I'm sure that I've said it myself many times as well, and so have many people around me. But one of the biggest things this pandemic has highlighted throughout the last several months is inequality in many shapes and forms, created and sustained by a broken system. And after all the lives that we've lost and all the families that have been torn apart, the worst possible thing we could do is go back to this normal. We need to look at all the things we have learned in this moment, all the priorities that have shifted, as well as how we could be better prepared for a crisis that was inevitable, such as this one. Let's not go back to a normal that was broken to begin with. Let's use this moment to build the new normal. So with that in mind, I'll be reading some small snippets from two of my favourite chapters from the book, as well as the foreword by the author that encapsulate the idea of change viewed through the lens of the individual identity within the home and the city. We in Syria have been in the news since 2011. The world has been watching us, and we have been watching ourselves, getting killed, tortured and uprooted. We have seen our buildings demolished, our cities destroyed, and our archaeological treasures vandalized. These images have been on display so much that we rarely question why all this has happened. In politics and history, when narratives are assembled, parties tell their own sides of the story. It is only through architecture that we see the point of view that is no one's in particular and everyone's in general. Buildings do not lie to us. They tell the truth without taking sides. Every little detail in an urban configuration is an honest register of a lived story. In this book, I try to show that the built environment we find not only indicators of events that have already occurred, but also portends of what could or might still occur. In addition, I try to show how architecture in my country has played a vital role in creating, directing and heightening conflicts between warring factions by facilitating poor choices and narrowing viable alternatives. I write about the shape of settlements and related economic systems, the moral code inspired by architecture of a place, and the ways in which architectural choices can determine questions of identity and home. Relating to another reason why I wrote this book, it should be noted that even in countries that seem to be distant from our own misfortune in Syria, especially other countries touched by the so-called Arab Spring, notions of identity and the home are just as much in jeopardy. The world has watched with anguish as ISIS has vandalized or threatened treasured sites such as Palmyra in Syria and Assyrian towns in Iraq. It has witnessed the tragic destruction of the old souks of Aleppo and Homs, along with countless ancient buildings and relics caught in the crossfire. These losses, despite their severity, are of course incomparable to the human losses, the wasted and damaged lives of innocents, and the destruction of the social fabric. But they constitute further reason for me to write this book, to consider the paths that have led to this ordeal and to shed light on the role played by the built environment. I suggest that failure to create architecture that can constitute a home for its users stems from a loss of identity, which in turn has causes to go deep into the psychology of our people. When we look at what is being built in the Middle East today and how it is being built, the loss of identity becomes glaringly apparent, as does this jarring disconnection between rich heritage of the past and empty modernism now being imported to form the present. Grief over the violence that ISIS has perpetrated on innocent ancient buildings can be viewed against reactions towards the mass destruction of entire cities. What is the ancient site? Why is it that ancient sites mean so much to all of us? Why is it a scratch on a column in Palmyra of more consequence than the destruction of an entire concrete building? Furthermore, how was it that we vandalized our own cities in Syria before war came to deliver the final blows? And how should we rebuild what has been destroyed so that it will not happen again? In searching for answers to these questions, I have lived a certain kind of life. Not to my mind the easiest one. In telling the story of my city and the story of my country, I also tell my own story, insofar it is relevant. I hope that readers will learn something from these kind of stories that will help to avert in other places the kind of destruction that we have had to suffer in Syria. The legitimate question, why did this happen, has received all kinds of rhetorical answers and has inspired all sorts of conflicts. We have seen mutual blame being laid by two parties who act if they have arrived at the scene of a bloody football match, only to discover that each player in the team is a team on his own and that no one is suffering more than the ball. Why did this happen? We will look at the answers in the pages of this book. Many people simply wish things would go back to the way they were. I have heard this phrase many times from different kinds of people, and each time I hear it, I think, why would anyone support a process of massive change than simply, and very late in the day, regret the destructive repercussions and want things to go back to the way they were? Even if the individual wasn't personally involved in the process of change, why would he or she want things to be simply to be as they were? Why not wish for better? Why settle for the state of instability that brought us here in the first place? This gives me the feeling that we haven't learnt any lessons from all that has happened, that we have never reflected on anything or tried to relate cause and effect. The habit of dreaming about a tomorrow matching yesterday brings to mind a short story. A poor villager lived with his wife in a shabby one-room shed. The woman continually complained about her cramped conditions and nagged her husband to provide a better home. Although he lacked money, this man didn't lack wit. One day he brought his wife what he called a gift, a goat to live inside their tiny room with them. As it was cold outside, the woman reluctantly acknowledged that they had to bring the goat indoors. After a few days, the man brought another gift. This time it was a hen. The same story was repeated over the next few weeks. Each time a new animal was brought into an even more suffocating room, until one day the man decided to move all the animals out and get rid of them all at once. The woman couldn't have been happier. She showered her husband with thanks and contemplated with great contentment the spacious home that was now theirs. In the case of Syria, however, there is no such easy way back to the things as they used to be, for the shabby little room has been destroyed. Still, I could never wish for things to go back to the way they were, to an era where I, like hundreds and thousands of disorientated young people, felt stuck in time and space, waiting for nothing to happen, waiting as everybody, consciously or unconsciously, was waiting. I was jailed behind the bars of nothingness. While Homs, the place where I was born and raised, is the third biggest city in Syria, it always seemed to me like a neglected village where nothing much happened and every day was pretty much the same. I used to hate holidays and weekends because the leisure facilities were so inadequate that there wasn't a single place my children could have a decent experience. No functional public parks, no cultural centres open to the public in a systematic or organised way, no zoos, no amusement parks, and even if those places had existed, there would have been no exciting activities, no safety measures, no tasteful or memorable architecture. In those days, my children and I would pick up other people's empty potato chips bags and plastic bottles just to clear our space on the patches of greenery beside the road where people, lacking other options, would have their picnics. No one else was motivated enough by our actions to pick up even a tissue. Nevertheless, I was convinced that I was teaching my children a lesson. I insisted on telling them all about the stipulated heights and the details of the pavements and street planning. I didn't want them to grow up and think their surroundings were acceptable the way they were. And I didn't want them to shrug off the ugliness, even if its existence would never be their fault. Every walk in the city was a struggle for me. Of course, this was not the most important concern in a country where if you were arrested as a thief who was trying to rob you, you were just as likely to end up in jail as the thief. Favoritism and bribes were the only system, and they functioned smoothly because the vast majority of people were reconciled to the fact that this was the way things were. Every sector had its own mafia, its own game rules, and very few were unwilling to participate. Even fewer were willing to fight, since the battles could take a lifetime, so the majority chose one of two paths: either the way out to the Gulf or the West, or the way in to corruption and degradation. It is only natural for immortality to shout louder than its opposition, just as dark spout shouts above the white cloth on the table. But when immortality prevails and life loses its equilibrium, as it has done in Syria, things can only get worse. The future for most Syrians has become a word of one syllable: mine. It means having a home, a car, a family, a steady income. In the current matchbox world, ideals, dreams, and public spirit are all considered laughable. You may be accused of being crazy, suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder, or behaving like an elitist snob if you try to maintain standards. Stop acting as though you were raised abroad, snapped a friend, when I refused to sit in the smoke-filled room. I fought with every taxi driver in the city over speeding limits, crossing red lights, smoking in the car. Demanding such rights was considered a pretentious luxury, and laws that had once been passed to protect those rights were no longer enforced. At the time, I didn't dream of owning a home. Why would I run after the carrot with my tongue on the floor just to live my old age in peace? I simply wanted, as innocent young people still want, to be somebody, to do something, but without deviousness or force. But that was, and still is, too much to ask. Wondering about the causes of this war reminds me of a lung cancer patient wandering around the causes of his disease when he has been a couch potato all his life, smoking heavily, drinking to excess, and gorging on junk food. No matter how diverse and serious the external threats, a healthy country would not fall apart in the face of a crisis. And no matter how corrupt and ruthless the governing powers, a healthy people would not eat each other up like savages. There is a saying that money and power don't change people, they just show them as they truly are. War does exactly the same. Ignorance mixed with injustice makes for a deadly cocktail. In Syria, this mixture is our daily dose. The glass has been filling over time. One can sense it in almost every aspect of people's lives. And the cost inflicted on the built environment has played a major role in heightening and perpetuating what has turned into a major catastrophe. The battle for a home. What is a home? The question has haunted me for a long time, and the war in my country has taken me through several stages in search of an answer. At the very moment when I imagine I have arrived at a response, the letters blur before my eyes and become illegible. The truth is that I had no idea what home was before I saw the people of my country killing each other over its definition. But unless they know what home is, architects surely cannot create a settlement or a city. As a result of my country's war, people have lost both their homes and their cities, sometimes destroying them with their own hands, sometimes watching them disappear beneath the rubble. Some have sold their settlements, others have been sold by them, and this love-hate relationship between people and places has reduced them both to dust. And as people are blown hither and thither across the land, the question arises, have they chosen asylum or been chosen by it? And how long are they going to remain in this state? These questions can be answered with a story that begins with a dream of a home and ends with a dream of a home. A home of one's own was the eternal dream of every Syrian before the war. You grew up watching people chasing the carrot, with few ever obtaining it. Home ownership was the ceiling of everyone's aspiration, whoever they were and wherever they came from. The home was not just a place to stay in, it was a guarantee of existence. I own a home, therefore I exist. The first response to a man proposing marriage would be, do you have a home? And if the answer was yes, the next question would invariably be, own or rent? And then everything was clear, since the chance of owning a home, unless by inheritance or theft, was roughly equal to the chance of becoming a president. A doctor or an engineer would flog himself not to achieve a major breakthrough or invent a revolutionary device, but to collect the price of his dream home before death collected him. But why has this dream been so difficult to achieve? Syria is not Japan in terms of space per capita. It is a sequence of vertical ecological regions from the Mediterranean shore where a few linear cities are squeezed between the adjacent lush mountains with their scattered towns and villages through the green basin areas where most of these cities are, to the vast arid interiors where there is little development. There is plenty of space and the weather is not too bad. The four seasons are distinct and equal, as in a science lesson. Over 34% of the population are of young working age, and yet none of these productive forces can fulfill humanity's basic requirement, which is shelter. Following the expropriation of the 1950s, the government adopted 5-year plans and legislations designed to turn population towards an industrial economy. To this end, it gathered up people from towns and villages and brought them to places of production. In 1953, municipalities were assigned to the task of creating social housing to accommodate the newcomers. In 1961, the General Housing Organisation was created in order to study the situation and implement the necessary policies. The Housing Hydra then began to grow its many heads: the Ministry of Housing and Construction, the General Organisation for Housing, the Regional Planning Committees, the Ministry of Local Administration, and the General Authority for Real Estate Development and Investment. This monster has snapped up hopes of Syrians through 11 5-year plans, so that in 2010, unmet demand stood at 1.5 million units, while 40% of all housing was of the informal kind. In other words, improvised and without proper incorporation into any urban plans. According to the 2010 census, the urban population formed 56% of the total of these. Of these, 9 million, in other words, nearly 50% of the total population were living in slums and informal housing. Despite this, 23% of housing units were registered as vacant. Why this failure to meet the demand for housing? It cannot be because there is not enough land. How else could the informal housing complexes have been built? Nor is the construction industry failing. The new buildings filling entire districts around the city are proof of its strength. The relevant factors are rather these: the quality of new housing, the infrastructure, location, and demography of districts where it is built, and of course, most importantly, the cost of the buildings themselves. For the whole process of locating, planning, and building is entirely corrupt and in the hands of what is publicly called the real estate mafia. Clusters of raw buildings pop up in remote and isolated locations with absolutely no urban or architectural planning. Freestanding concrete blocks of awkward configuration and meaningless internal arrangement. Every detail of these projects speaks of inhumanity. Shape, size, organisation of room, all is as though willfully done against nature. After approaching the block across a bumpy ground littered with construction cast-offs, your shoes covered in dust, you have to choose between a railless stairway or a wobbly elevator, should the lift well actually be filled with one. This is a rare luxury. in order to reach the dream home, for which you have waited 20 years, and tightened your belt until you have a Barbie doll waist. All the surface finishes are shabby, and as though glued on, waiting to fall off at the first slam of a door. The ceilings are low and oppressive, the rooms arranged without logic or order, the doors too narrow for furniture to pass through, and the windows badly fitted so that breezes whip your neck wherever you sit. You try to find a single clean edge in your brand new nest, but you fail. Wherever the wall meets the floor or window frames are cut into the walls, there are smudges of paint and plaster slapped over the uneven joins. You try to get over the aesthetic aspect and focus instead on the positive fact that you have finally broken free from the skyrocketing rent fees at the end of every month and from the nomadic life, constantly packing up and moving while playing the ruthless game of real estate or dealing. You try to remember how long you have waited to have a place of your own, but where you don't have to live in one room at your parents' or in-laws, but the roaring sound coming from the water tap on you wash your face is a wake-up call, slapping you on the very face because there is no water. The non-existent infrastructure of the place means that you have to purchase your own water by begging a wandering container driver to come to your remote area. You have escaped the rental market only to be at the mercy of the service market. You will have to be constantly occupied from now on in obtaining water, electricity, drainage and other life essentials. The rest of your life will be spent propping up your dream home, which in the end has far more need of you than you of it. How were these Frankenstein housing projects created? Under the 5-year housing plan, the governments formed partnerships between public, private and cooperative sectors to sell pieces of land to contractors requiring no vision or planning strategy, and with intrusive corruption all along the way. The lure was the availability of public loans offered by the land bank and similar public institutions, which encouraged people to register for their dream home, paying in advance, and condemned to spend the rest of their productive life enslaved to debt. In 2002, the General Housing Organisation launched the largest program of housing for the young, declaring the government would finance 30% of it without interest. This was followed by other projects such as housing for workers, savings housing, and popular housing. Nevertheless, the dismal situation remained unchanged, while fraud and corruption scandals proliferated. The cities extended octopus-like arms studded with stalled construction works and ugly vacant blocks next to the burgeoning informal housing and slums. Meanwhile, the government issued yet more legislation, adding corrective laws to the previous failing ones. The hydra grew a few more heads, with more committees and experts. Foreign planners were called in through the EU to draw up plans and prepare studies that would never leave the table. Moving blindly with no urban vision, the government finally announced the Supreme Committee of National Housing Strategy in 2004 to work on developing an official housing policy. Strategy in 2004. Needless to say, the strategy did not see the light of day. People continued to build the unplanned informalities, taking responsibility for themselves and enduring all the growing problems of infrastructure, services and sanitization, while real estate in the cities became the most lucrative kind of business and for the most people beyond the reach of even a dream. In such a market, an architect is a ghost architect. He has no role in creating visions or suggesting improvements. If lucky, he will be called in by some well-off family to refurbish their interior according to a standardized taste. Those who manage to climb up enough to take part in EU's legislation plan consultations or similar collaborations with foreign or public bodies will most likely have to pass through the prescribed network of sycophancy and corruption. The architect's mission in such circumstances is a long way from creating places that will nurture us with peace and beauty, suggesting moral sentiment and lasting values, defining for us a greater sense of home. How can an architect create home in any building when he himself has never experienced it, when all that he has seen around him is trampled life that seeks relentlessly to emerge, like the persistent green shoots that spring up from the smallest cracks in the tarmac of a road? Home is the goal of architecture, and a true home is like a mirror that always shows us our best profile, no matter where we stand in relation to it. But when a building shows only our worst side, and when it is the wreckage of our dreams, then it is no longer a home, and nor is it architecture. The The quest for home in Syria has become a rat race, with the government constant plotting to find some way to extend a metre or two sideways into a porch or upwards into a roof. As if on standby, most new constructions are incomplete, awaiting the next stage of legislation. Then, every now and then, government reverts to its favourite game and orders demolition instead. This kind of built environment sends out a clear message of a trophy and of subversion of moral and social values. It is visible in the aesthetic devastation, a jungle of mishap and inhuman forms in which survival is not just for the fittest, but for the wildest and the greediest. In short, it is tangible as a precursor to war. And of course, that is what we have witnessed, as human beings were wiped out, together with their shadows, which were their homes. These shadows were hit, punctured and tortured like bodies that produced them, and now they lie in ruin. Millions of people are now displaced and uprooted, wandering in their changed life that can only get worse, where to go, what to hold on to, where to cut their losses, and where to take risk. Some have had the luxury of reflecting on these questions for a while. Others have had to make a decision while covered in blood and fleeing under fire. Disasters, both natural and man-made, are habitual occurrences on Earth, but when you lose your home and the land your home once spat upon, and when you lose them in a world that has decided to which party you have lost them, and when you lose them without ever knowing when and from who they might be regained, if ever, that's when you have lost your shadow in this world, the proof of your being here under the shared light of the sun. Not all who have left their homes were absolutely compelled to do so. Some chose to leave, in various different ways. Some were wealthy enough not to have to preserve or have patience. They found no reason to stay where they were as a clear alternative. They were able to buy their tickets out and resume their lives in countries such as Lebanon, UAE, Egypt and Turkey, or in the USA or Europe. Many such people haven't lost their homes in any case, since they were located outside the eye of destruction. If these people could have persevered, life in their urban areas would have been difficult, but not impossible. Others enjoyed the luxury of choice without having the money to buy security at the end of it. These citizens were tempted by the seemingly half-open door of the Western world, which they had always considered a gateway to prosperity. The coveted grass is green on the other side, which has always promised advancement and order, is now only a boat ride away. Naturally, war merchants have not left this lucrative niche market untapped. Organised networks of human trafficking have stretched their strings across all borders, while people have encouraged one another to leave the mess behind and trust in the promised heaven that is Europe. Those people who sell all they have and launch themselves towards the rumoured prosperity overseas explain their choice by reference to the future of death in their country, which they themselves, out of covetousness, have sentenced to death. By contrast, those who stay to endure the bombs and bullets have clung to what matters most to them, which is a network of attachments and responsibilities that has grown here, in what once was their home. Of course, these attachments too are jeopardized, so there are no other reasons to migrate besides the loss of one's homes or livelihood. Having a young son who might at any time be drafted into the army, or kidnapped for a ransom, or thrown into prison, a highly lucrative business that has evolved between officers, attorneys and judges, and has become an urgent reason for many to leave. Home has also taken on another definition for many of the uprooted. Not a place of temporary shelter, grudgingly accepted for a few days or months in the aftermath of some natural disaster, but a sanctuary that has been lived in for years already, and from which there is no foreseeable exit despite intolerable conditions. People in the country areas around the northern city of Idlib have been forced to live in orchards or even caves, caught in the crossfire between battling war fronts, sometimes hit by the official army, sometimes by the alliance opposing them, unable to escape and without electricity, running water, doctors or any of the conveniences of modern life. Only women can go out in search of provisions, since men would be instantly arrested. Food comes from the farmland, any excess being traded with the besieging troops. Every sunrise brings a major shift in events. As I write, Idlib has fallen to the opposition, which means more dramatic changes, new forms of homelessness, new forms of torture for the local people who pay the price for every victory, no matter whose it is. Internal displacement usually takes form in people being forced from their homes into temporary shelters, temporary here being a euphemism. The shelter mostly consists of a building belonging to state schools. These schools have single unified design, reminiscent of a prison. An L-shaped block covered by a sprayed stucco on whose spiky surfaces you have to be careful not to scratch yourself. The windows are covered with a fine metal mesh that holds the sky at bay. As children, we used to stand by this mesh, pushing our little fingers through the holes like convicts behind a bar. Today, these sheets support pouches that hang from them on wires. The closets and cupboards of people who sleep on the spouse mattresses spread beneath them. Their bathrooms are like communal toilets, with one deep wall-long trough that we as children were so repelled by that we would contain ourselves all day until we got home, rather than make use of them. Families, the very old and the very young included, make their homes here, the borders of which are defined by a single bedsheet pinned to the ceiling. Alternatively, displaced people are stuffed into unfinished concrete blocks seized in the course of war, and eloquent expressions of brutality all around with their bare concrete surfaces, exposed cables, if there is any power at all, and sheets of cardboard for window shields. Or there is the best case scenario, obtaining the home of someone who is leaving, who might give you the deeds out of charity, by way of lending out the place for a while, or by way of a cooperative arrangement in which you undertake to protect the home from vandalism while the owner is away. Of course, all such agreements become provisional as the chaos worsens. The government that crippled our civil society in order to maximise its own control has effectively precluded sympathy between the settled community and the displaced. Shockingly, philanthropic people who have donated food or money to the new school residents have sometimes been arrested, since officially these needy people were only allowed to receive help from international organisations. Under strict political terms, in Syrian streets today, you can see homes carried along in plastic bags or on a bicycle. Many children who open their eyes on this world have not known what it's like to belong to a place that belongs to you. Young children of 8 or 9 go out to grab a 70-centimetre wide mattress that are sometimes distributed as humanitarian aid, and get back home thrilled with this new room of their own. For years now, the public parks of Damascus have been homes for the homeless, but nowadays even the settled have become homeless and have found themselves living in the rubble of half-demolished rooms under ceilings that might fall on them any time. Of course, there are sad stories of homeless to be told of every major city, but the catastrophe of the homelessness in this war does not reside only in the swarms of displaced people, but in the local fissures that have resulted. A new generation is being born and raised without true belonging, without a shared identity, and without education or values, knowing only that there is no place in this world to call their own. In Syria, people haven't just lost part of their identity, they have lost most of their built history and all of their present. They are living in fragmented ruins, with only a hazy memory of their identity as citizens of a shared territory and home. Identity, in all its form, depends on continuity and memory, and our architecture is the main publicly recognisable register of that. Of course, architecture is not the axis around which all human life rotates, but it is our most effective register, a dynamic and interactive one that has the power to suggest and even direct human activity. In that sense, settlement, identity and social integration are both the producers and the product of effective urbanism. Registered continuity and collective memory are most visible through architecture, which marks out a place as ours. Take away signs and symbols of citizenship that have resulted in a war of identities in the other sense. Factitious groups identifying with each other on the basis of misreading of religions and a desperate need to define us against them, to define identity not by what we all share, but by what excludes others. Identity, in the positive sense, stems from the power of accomplishment, which I suggest is a key measure of acceptance among desperate social groups and communities. The way this accomplishment is weighted is affected by the media, but the kind of accomplishment I have in mind is that which belongs to civilizations and can be a source of national pride. Old monuments and artifacts are part of such an accomplishment and contribute to our sense of who we are. Two types of accomplishments shape people's sense of identity. Those that give them pleasure, either through beauty or some other value, and those that make them proud through continuity and a sense of contribution. Both are made tangible in the built environment through those details that call to us with the voice of home, the beauty of a window frame or decorative moulding, the shade of a planted tree, memories from childhood of a door through which one entered into the safety and love, reminiscences from later years of the atmospheric background to friendship and family ties. The pleasurable experience of place through its configuration is part of what attaches us to it, part of what makes it into a there, a durable and recognizable frame within which our individual lives occur, and one which helps us to make part of one another. Values are implied and sustained by this kind of configuration, helping to attach people in another way to what is deep in themselves and what demands a shared and civilized identity. Thank you everyone for listening. Here's the book as a reminder, The Battle for Home by Marwa Al-Sabouni. And I'm just going to show some of the nice sketches actually that are sort of peppered around some of the descriptions. They're all really nice, and alongside the text actually they give you a really good sense of the atmosphere and some of the descriptions that Marwa does. So thanks everyone for listening. Hope you have a good evening. Bye bye.